Hello everyone, welcome to the Thrive Wearables track at this year's Giant Health Show. Delighted to have you here for this session today. This is one of 5 sessions that we're running at this year's show, and we're really happy to be back yet again running these sessions at Giant. We've been here for the last couple of years, and of course it's slightly different this year, but we're all mucking in and working with this new system, and we're delighted to have brought together a fantastic panel for this session. So just a bit about Thrive. We are a design and development consultancy based in the UK, and we have a mission to create wearable products and product services that have significant health and wellness impact. We really judge ourselves on that impact rating, and we work very closely with a range of stakeholders across startup companies all the way through to corporate organizations to create those wearable products. You can find out about us and about the speakers at this session today at thrivewearables.com/giant2020. And I'm sure you'll be able to find out all sorts of other interesting stuff about the speakers today by looking on LinkedIn and connecting. There will be live sessions after this first part of the day, and we will be hosting those through the digital systems that are available at Giant. And I'm going to introduce now Steve Parr, the MedTech growth consultant that is running this session. Delighted to have you here, Steve, talking today about digital biomarkers and how do we get the quality real-world data sets we need for effective clinical trials. Bit of a mouthful, but I'm sure it's going to be very exciting. I'm really looking forward to hearing the panel today. So thank you very much, Steve, and welcome.
Well, good afternoon, evening, morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to facilitate this session, and I'm delighted to be joined by 3 experts in the field. First of all, I'll do some personal introductions, let everybody know who's on the panel today, and then we'll get right on into the discussion. So I'm Steve Parr, as Jacob mentioned. I'm a growth consultant working with innovative healthcare and medtech companies, and that tends to revolve around sales, funding, go-to-market, business development, and market access. I also sit as commercial expert on SBRI Healthcare Innovation Panel for the Wessex HSN and a number of other hats. Bill, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I'm a VP of product positioning at Signant Health. I've been working in e-clinical product development for around 20 years, but I'm also a scientist, and my area is clinical outcome assessments. So I've done recent scientific work for leading cross-industry research groups through the Critical Path Institute and also through the DIA on the use of wearables and sensors around clinical trials and clinical trial endpoints. So yeah, great to be here. Thank you, Steve.
Okay.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you first to Steve and Thrive Wearables for putting together this panel. I'm excited to participate. My name is Kate Lyden. I am the Chief Science Officer at VivoSense, which for those of you who don't know, VivoSense is a data analytics and consulting company that specializes in real-world data from wearable sensors. We primarily work in the clinical trial space, but also venture into healthcare delivery at times as well. I joined VivoSense about 1.5 years ago now, and prior to that position, I spent most of my time in academia, but I've also worked for a couple of device manufacturers as well, so I've been kind of all over the board there. In academia, my research primarily focused on developing methods to process data from wearable sensors and also validating those methods. And then using those tools in high-risk patient populations to investigate how real-world behavior impacts risk for chronic disease. So super excited to be here today.
Thank you, Kate. And Myles.
Thanks very much, Steve, and thanks for the invitation to the panel for this very interesting and relevant topic at the moment. So hello everyone, my name is Myles. I am the Global Digital Health Partnerships Lead at Ipsen Pharmaceuticals. I'm a physician by training. I was qualified in the UK and worked in the NHS for about 4 years, finishing up in oncology before shifting into industry where I've held commercial, medical and digital roles. Passion very much is digital health and trying to bring in the right forms of technology, particularly into industry, to help improve patient outcomes and accelerate healthcare.
Thank you very much. So we talked about, Jacob reminded us what the title of the session is, and I'd really like to kick things off with the panel by asking you, what, from your experience of decentralized trials, what's really worked? For example, where clinical trial effectiveness has been greatly improved, or where real-world evidence and wearables have actually transformed the data quality and volume, or where new biomarkers have enabled different clinical endpoints, or anything else that struck you directly from your experience of clinical trials. Anybody?
Well, let me kick it off then, Steve. I think in terms of effectiveness for decentralized trials, I've probably got a couple of just small examples. And I think at Signant Health, our technology solutions that we provide for clinical trials have applicability in decentralized trials as well as traditional studies. And so things like direct-to-patient medication supply, eCOA can be used obviously at site or at home. Remote assessments via video. So a couple of examples, one being the integration of home courier providers around a very large study which required stool sample collection alongside patient-reported outcomes. So a patient could use our app. They can complete their patient-reported outcomes diaries every day. And if they required a sample to be picked up, to be analysed, they could then trigger that courier interaction through the same app that they were collecting their patient-reported outcomes data. And at the same time as the collection occurring, of course, the new sample kit for the next sample was also provided to the patient. So this was a 15,000 patient study. So it would have been impractical to do this sort of thing, to ask patients to go somewhere, or to, it would have been hugely burdensome, I think, to operate in a way, that we, aside from this particular example. I think another example, a pediatric study needing daily IV injections for a period of time. They started out doing those injections at clinic, but getting the patient into clinic every day was obviously, again, burdensome both for the child and for the caregiver. And so after 3 days, they would then receive the injection packs delivered direct to their homes. A home nurse would arrive, they'd check the medication, they would administer the injection, and they do the drug accountability piece as well. So again, huge reduction, again, in burden for the patient and the caregiver. And I think just a final example, as we hit the COVID pandemic, earlier this year, and obviously still dealing with that now, many of our clinical trials, in which we were collecting clinician-reported outcomes, so perhaps psychiatric ratings, where you might have a 20-minute interview with a psychiatrist face-to-face, and they would be assessing you for perhaps symptoms of depression or anxiety or something else. Those assessments would have been missed otherwise, because patients couldn't come into clinic due to self-isolating. But what we could do, of course, was do those over video and have remote assessments with the physician and the patient being able to interact in the same way that they would have done face-to-face, but over the video. So maybe just a few examples of where I think, there's huge potential. And, it doesn't necessarily mean the whole study has to be remote, but these remote study components can be really valuable in individual studies.
You touched on a really interesting point there, Bill, around the patient-reported outcomes piece and how it's becoming increasingly important, particularly for industry, to try and get access to that sort of insight. And the way that we historically or traditionally approach that, it's very ad hoc, it's very inconsistent. And what we're struggling with at the moment is that within the data sets, if you look at a real-world evidence point of view, which is a huge step that's happened over the last couple of years, in particular, how we are able to access data in compliant ways, and suddenly we're recognizing the value of what we can do with this data. I can give a couple of examples just from a real-world evidence point of view, particularly in the US, where the FDA, I think, are real leaders in this space of adapting and advancing guidance around real-world evidence and what you can use it for, and understanding the value of that. And we've seen a couple of really key examples in, I think, last year. Pfizer had a product that are actually able to expand their license off the back of some real-world evidence trials, combining that with phase 1 clinical data, which was absolutely pivotal. It's a huge step forward. The value of that for industry is vital. One of the things I do commonly see, however, is those PROs are often missed off because the traditional data, we just haven't really captured it in that digitalized way. So there's a huge gap that needs filling, and people are starting to almost input this now from normal clinic visits from patients. So we start capturing that. So we might be able to start using the data that we have there for synthetic trial, for control arms, for example, from the trial side. But until that happens at the moment, we're almost relying on prospective clinical trials with wearables and applications to capture these PROs that are hopefully validated to some form of quality of life outputs that we can obviously then bring that in. But it's massively shifting. So I'm interested to see what else, from a PRO perspective, you've both been involved in as well.
So I'm going to shift away from PRO for a minute and just say that one of the areas that VivoSense has seen significant success has been in rare disease, specifically using what's called respiratory inductance plethysmography to measure respiratory outcomes in different disease states, including Rett syndrome and infant spinal muscular atrophy. And these are examples of endpoints that would not be feasible to have these people come into a site to measure. It's measured, during wake continuously, and so to have them in a clinic continuously for multiple days at a time. I mean, you could do an inpatient study, but that's just 9 times out of 10 not feasible. And specifically in rare disease, where recruiting patients is difficult, and you often have to recruit from all over the world to be able to, expand your reach for the patients you can recruit by collecting these data at home, I think has really been significant. And these endpoints have been approved as both primary and secondary endpoints by different regulatory agencies. And I think that, this is traditionally a risk-averse field, but because it's rare disease, I think that they're willing to, bend a little bit. And of course, you need to provide, evidence of validation of this method in these groups, in this specific clinical populations. But I think that they're open to exploring these more innovative endpoints in rare disease. So.
Mm-hmm. Glad you brought up rare disease. So very much the focus from our organization. We're a rare disease company, so I completely echo and agree everything you just said there. I think there's a real opportunity for us to get more involved and providing more services around these rare disease patients by capturing these new digital biomarkers we can start creating. I'm really interested to understand in the things that you've done. Have you got to a stage where within these trials you're starting to capture the additional data points you bring together, even within these populations, to start creating more prediction-like algorithms off the back of that, or at least within that conversation, because that's where these opportunities can lead to, right? Particularly within these subset populations within rare disease patients, it creates this huge opportunity to start building additional services around that. Have you come across that at any point to date?
We have not, and of course, I think all wearable sensors create that opportunity for these predictive algorithms to better predict onset and progression of disease. But in the specific rare disease state, we've not seen that. And I'd just also like to point out that I think that one of the extreme benefits for rare disease is that most of the time the endpoints are caregiver report. Right. And so being able to collect something objectively really can supplement those reports. I'm not suggesting replace them completely, but really being able to augment them and supplement them. I think that that's extremely valuable.
Some of you, I think, have touched on the issue of the pandemic as well, which has obviously created extra challenges. Bit of a simplistic question, but in terms of gauging the impact there, I mean, in some areas we've had previously up to 70%, 75% of trials failing in a pre-pandemic period. What has that done for normal, if you like, clinical trials? And perhaps with that extra question to Kate and Myles about in the rare disease area as well. What's the challenge that the pandemic has brought onto clinical trials in these straitened circumstances?
Do you want? So I'll tackle that first. I mean, I think the pandemic across the board has brought the challenge of getting patients into a clinic. Obviously, I mean that becomes a risky behavior for all studies, and so being able to measure these endpoints without bringing a patient in contact with potentially infectious other human beings is obviously great. And I think that folks are now much more open to considering these remote monitoring technologies. I won't say that I think that it has completely skyrocketed the use of these remote monitoring technologies in clinical trials, because even though they're interested, that infrastructure isn't there. You know, if they didn't have that set up from the beginning. So they're gaining interest in it and they're exploring it more. But I don't think we've really seen a huge spike in the use of these tools from the pandemic. And I'd be interested to hear what Myles and Bill have to say about that, if they've experienced the same thing as well.
Yeah, well, I think we have, but I would just to sort of answer Steve's question, you know, in terms of what has this brought in terms of the type of data that we're collecting. I think it's added variability to the data that we're collecting potentially, because, you know, we've had to adapt the way in which we're going to collect it. You know, we start out with a clinical trial with a very standardized approach. You know, we're going to collect the quality of life data, for example, at the site visit using a tablet computer, and they're going to be exactly the same for everybody. So you eliminate a number of different sources of variability. And then we have to adapt because of the pandemic, and people can't come into site anymore. So we're going to now say, okay, we don't want to stop the study. We're going to continue to collect that data, but perhaps one approach might be we're going to do telephone interviews to collect that data with the patient, or another approach might be we use a web backup solution and the patients can access it themselves from home via the web in a less supervised manner. And while we believe that the data will be consistent and reliable, even when measured in that different approach, you know, there is that question as to whether we've introduced some additional variability and what the impact of that might have on the sensitivity of the study to show the treatment effects.
Myles, do you have any comment?
Just to echo what I think Kate just summarised there, it's been a really challenging time for industry over the last 9 months, and I think we lose sight that the people that have been affected by this has been pretty challenging, and it's not just for the trials, for the treatment as well. DataCam, one of HTR UK data hubs, released a study just looking at the reduction of people being diagnosed with cancers and coming in for therapy. And some of those things you can't avoid, and that relates to some of these trials, right? They have to come into centres. So how do we pivot? And as Kate's mentioned, it doesn't happen overnight. It's this huge infrastructure that needs to be adapted. And if trials are already started, then it's going back and almost trying to amend protocols and things, which is, you know, very, very difficult to do. It takes time. So I agree. I haven't seen a huge shift, but I don't think it's because of the unwillingness or understanding now the relevance, how the world is changing and the importance and impact that this can have going forward. I just think that it's going to take a bit more time for people to really shift and think about this in a very different way, like we've been forced to over the last 12 months. So I very much expect over the next couple of years to see greater uptake from a wearable and a remote monitoring perspective.
Yeah, and I'll just give an example somewhat of what Bill was mentioning, that we've experienced a lot of folks that have ongoing clinical trials that use in-clinic 6-minute walk tests as an endpoint. So many trials use that. And a lot of sponsors have reached out to us of how can we measure that remotely? And of course, we have wearable accelerometers, different types of kinematic sensors that we can use to measure things about movement and gait and behavior. But we all know that the in-clinic 6-minute walk test is standardized, right? Like, this is a standard performance test, and being able to conduct that in the real world, it's not possible. Yes, there are other things that you can measure that are related to that. But to exactly mimic the 6-minute walk test out of clinic that's essentially impossible. And so we've had a lot of folks interested in doing that, and they come to us and what can we do? And we do have, VivoSense has an endpoint that we call best 6-minute effort, which we relate to the in-clinic test. It's essentially a real world parallel of the 6-minute walk test, but that of course is not the same thing. And so they're interested in that, but then for them to think about how do I shift my trial operationally to be able to collect this, that's been a real barrier for people.
Poses that interesting question of, are these endpoints fit for purpose anymore? We're moving towards this piece, right? And then it drives into, okay, well, if we need to define something that is more fit for purpose, how do we go about that to ensure the community, the scientific community, can trust it, will accept it within clinical literature, and then be able to use that as a new standard of care? And this is, I think we all agree that we see this again and again at the moment, that it's still very much a learning that we're experiencing, but hopefully, given everything that's been going on recently, it's going to drive people to actually start exploring this and taking it more seriously, to really start validating these additional endpoints, which arguably could be more accurate and more clinically valid than what we've used historically.
Yeah. And certainly more real world. No, it's interesting. I was talking last week to a VP of project management for a global CRO, and he was echoing your comments, really, that the pandemic has shone a light, really, on the greater need for decentralized trials, real world evidence, etc. But this, as you said, Kate, the usage has not skyrocketed. There's something getting in the way. And that, I think, really is at the core of what this session is about. So I'd just like to move the conversation on just a tad, but continue with the same theme. I'd like to explore what is slowing and preventing the wider use of remote monitoring, and the uptake, as you said, Myles, about more or new biomarkers. How better real-world evidence and wearables can support this better data moving forward? Can we really burrow down into that? What's getting in the way? Because the pandemic is such a driver. I mean, obviously clinically driver, but to be blunt, financially as well. There's a lot of money and inefficiency brought into the system. Let's just burrow down into what's slowing down the uptake.
I think just adding to my previous point around, we're in this scenario where we're able to collect a lot of data, a lot of objective data, sometimes passively, continuously. This very exciting phase where we can do all of this, and the accessibility has just shot through the roof. The problem with it is trying to correlate it to a relevant phenotype, something that we can clinically validate against what historically has been defined as standard of care. And that's something I've mentioned previously, that unfortunately that standard of care may not be clinically appropriate anymore. Because is it really a gold standard? Like, the traditional biomarkers we use has been established using averages or heterogeneous populations, and trying to compare that with more digital biomarkers, it might not necessarily be a fair assessment. That's really difficult, because if everyone knows something, and that's what I clinically believe, that is the marker, that's what we've used for decades to assess this patient population or this clinical assessment or whatever, to then try and completely say, well, actually it's not fit for purpose, but if we validated it against that, we're getting lots of false negatives because it's not fit. What do we do? How do we start building that confidence and that trust that physicians and researchers are going to be able to use that now as future gold standard going forward? And that for me requires a lot of out-of-the-box thinking, a lot of adaptability in this space. It's very, very, very difficult to do that.
And it also raises the issue, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this, Bill, about wearable or actual device selection as well.
Yeah, so I think that is one of the barriers to perhaps the adoption, the sort of at scale adoption of wearables and sensors for clinical measures is exactly that. You know, what sort of evidence do we need to provide to a regulatory body to support the approach that we've taken to defend the particular device we've selected? And you know, there has been a lot of work done on this. There's a number of different consortia. You know, there's the Critical Path Institute, there's the CTTI group, there's DIME, there's a DIA, and quite a lot of these groups have come up with very similar approaches to how we might address that evidence piece. But I think that's the point. Is a sponsor organisation is going to be conservative and going to have questions about whether their data would be accepted at the end of the day. And so we know there are a number of things that we need to demonstrate, and it's whether we can actually pull that package of data together quickly enough to be able to do it. So, is the sensor itself providing raw measurements or raw data that's kind of accurate or reliable? Can we analytically validate the outcome measures that it produces? So if it's counting steps, can we demonstrate that in the particular patient population we're interested in, it's counting steps accurately or to enough accuracy that would be sufficient for a clinical endpoint? And then, the other point, I think, to some of the things Myles was talking about, some of the endpoint properties, we need to start to understand. So, one would be, do we understand what a meaningful change is in that endpoint? And again, going back to the kind of the rather substandard way we do this, we usually do that by comparing it to a gold standard, which we think we understand what a meaningful change is. And again, if we're not measuring exactly the same thing, or if the gold standard isn't actually very good, it becomes quite a difficult exercise to generate those endpoint properties that we need to support the use of that endpoint in a clinical trial. So, for me, that's one of the big barriers, I think. And but I do think we've moved a long way in the last 2 or 3 years in terms of understanding what's needed and how to do it. And I think that will start to drive adoption.
Kate, any thoughts?
Yeah, so that last point that Bill made there about we've come a long way, I would say that even in this past year, it feels like we've come a long way. Just the discussions that you hear folks having on panels like this, it feels like we've come a long way in talking about validation and what pieces of validation do we need, because I mean, for me, that and for VivoSense, that's at the foundation of everything we do. As Bill mentioned, counting steps. And the reality of it is that most of these step counting algorithms were developed in healthy populations. We need, at the end of the day, if we want to get our drug or whatever it is approved by different regulatory agencies, we need to, and we're using steps as an endpoint, we need to show evidence that we believe that we're counting steps accurately and that our tool is sensitive to change in that measurement as well. And we know that, patients with Parkinson's disease their gait is different than a patient with multiple sclerosis or ataxia or whatever it might be. So I think that it feels like we've made progress in that validation space and people at least having discussions around what's important, I think, is really important. But and to go back up to the point about clinical validity and being able to establish what is the minimal clinically important difference for this group, I think the reality of it, that's a barrier, but the reality of it is that this is still early days for these tools. And so that evidence and that evidence base is not there in most instances. And I know that this is a dirty word, but I like to promote pilot studies, natural history studies. Like, let's gather these data on these patient populations so that we can begin to gather that evidence needed to establish a minimal clinically important difference. Because at the end of the day, we're going to need evidence to support that when we're, submitting our protocol to whoever it might be. So yeah, I think we're making progress. But I think also I would encourage the field to not be afraid of, I think, small steps in that spectrum of progress.
Yeah, and Kate, I think I can kind of link to that idea around interpretation, because I guess minimal clinically important difference is all about interpreting the findings. And the other challenge I think we have is that we don't necessarily understand whether an endpoint is device specific. So for example, if I measure total number of steps per day using a Fitbit, I know I'm going to get a slightly different answer than if I use a Garmin or if I use an Apple Watch or something else. And so it's difficult for us to interpret these changes within an individual clinical trial, but when it comes to a regulator or a payer looking at data from different development programs or perhaps measuring what they think is the same endpoint but using a different device, it's very hard to find a way to accurately compare the results across perhaps different drug programs, for example. And so I kind of feel that's maybe less of a barrier for us looking at individual drug programs, but certainly a barrier for regulators and payers in terms of understanding how to interpret the data we provide.
I absolutely agree in that if this is validated in a Garmin, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's validated in a Fitbit or an Actigraph or whatever it might be. So I think that is absolutely a consideration that needs to be taken into account.
To what extent? Sorry, Myles, over to you.
Very, very quick point, just to kind of take on from what you both highlighted on a slightly different tangent, is that taking these sort of devices and wearables that you're describing and identifying these other endpoints, I think one thing that everyone's overlooks that we're aware of but don't really take it hugely into consideration is that this is personalizing in a way that we've never been able to do before, and it's very different to how we do healthcare. A lot of healthcare is really umbrella-like approach in a lot of what we do, and all of a sudden we're able to start getting insights in full population, but then look at an individual and personalizing it to a point of view that it's going to completely change the conversation. And physicians are going to suddenly be guided by what these wearables and what these digital biomarkers are telling them, not from a population, but for their individual patients that opposite them, but then have to suddenly trust and change a whole different way of how they approach their diagnosis, or what therapies they're going to pick, or how that individual is progressing over time or improving over time, and whatever marker that's relevant to them. It opens up like this whole other lens of this is a different way of doing healthcare. And it's great, it's brilliant, that's exactly what we want to be moving towards. But that's a huge culture shift, right? That's a huge barrier around how do we get people to start thinking that way, that we can believe and trust what we're validating and believe and trust what endpoints that we're coming up with, and then trying to say, well, yeah, but this patient is going to be slightly different to the other patient you've got next in the clinic. They might be really different, but they're telling you very different things, even though it might be the same endpoint. It's a very different, summarize that extremely well, but it's a very different approach. I think we overlook it sometimes because we just get so into it, but it's an extremely important point of how we're going to need to approach this in the future.
Yeah, the opportunity for personalized data is absolutely phenomenal. And also getting back to the practicalities of clinical trials, just in terms of patient engagement and patient retention as well. If you can do remote monitoring, these are all the goals that we're all aiming for, and I guess it's a sort of well-trod point. But going back to the previous point, if that's where we're heading, how do you broker this device variability? There is such a large reliance at the moment on the off-the-shelf. And often I get a little bit disappointed and depressed, really. People will use the standard products in a certain area because it has a track record. And part of the track record is knowing what the deficiencies are. And I get a little bit frustrated at this side of the chasm while we wait and we use the pre-used wearables and the regulatorily authorized ones. But in actual fact, there's a whole world out there which is, new endpoint focused, patient focused. How do we broker that? I mean, you talked before, Kate, about making small steps, which I do appreciate. But at some point, if you think of the millions involved, the expense of a clinical trial, surely it's worth doing a little bit more R&D and branching out in a new direction. I hope that's not too provocative, but I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Well, my immediate thought is that I would challenge everyone in the field to eliminate this phrase "off the shelf" from your vocabulary, because I just don't think I won't say 100% of the time, but 99.9% of the time, there's not an off-the-shelf solution for you. Like as Myles was saying, this is very patient-focused. This is personalized. Everything needs to be relevant for the patient population. And these sensor technologies, when you're collecting data at such high resolution, to get down to the nitty-gritty, the filter matters, right? Like the way that you're filtering the signal, the way that you're cleaning it, the way that you process it. There's, even within one device, there's multiple ways to derive an endpoint. So it's not even just between devices, but sometimes within a device. And I don't say that to scare people away from using these tools because the variability is too great and we don't know what we're getting. I say that to encourage folks to just really, think about and be thoughtful about how they're using them, and to engage others who have used these tools in a way that is similar to how they intend to use them, because there are people out there that have experience using these tools, and this is a new space for everyone. So I think, the more we can create the communication across organizations, then the more that I think people will start to really adopt that approach.
Yeah, no, I agree. I won't tell you how many times I've heard the word "off the shelf" in the last year. It will be quite depressing. Sorry, Bill, did you want to come in?
Well, I think just to add to what Kate said, and I guess coming from the patient-reported outcome side of the industry, we've faced this problem already because we've moved things from paper instruments, which have been well validated. They have a certain, certain format, a certain look and feel. We've put them onto electronic devices, and they might look and feel very different. We might change the way that a scale operates, for example. And we've done a lot of work to validate the fact that the measurement properties of that validated instrument haven't changed when we've moved it into a different format. And the same is true here. So this is what we're talking about. Can we demonstrate that the measurement properties of different devices are close enough so that they don't have a significant material impact on the endpoint measurement? And so it's almost down to endpoint developers to start to identify what are the tolerances in the inputs that are acceptable, that won't have a huge difference, make a huge impact on the endpoint measure itself, but you could accept. So I've got a step counter and I've got another one which has got a bias of 1%. Well, does that make a difference, a material impact on my clinical endpoint? Because if it doesn't, then I'm okay to switch that device and use a different one and measure that same endpoint and feel that actually my data will be comparable between those two different devices. But we don't really understand that yet, and it's probably very endpoint specific in terms of what those tolerances need to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can see we're getting towards the end of our session, so thank you very much. That was a fascinating discussion. If you'll forgive the cliche, I'd just like to ask you each in turn, what's the one thing, what's at the top of your list that is going to have the greatest impact if implemented, greatest impact in terms of improving clinical trial effectiveness and getting real world evidence into the cycle? Bill, alphabetically.
There you go. I think using these tools to get richer insights into our therapies and into our treatments. So, examples might be collecting data more frequently from home. So measuring tremor in a Parkinson's patient, I'm able to do it every day, and I'm able to look at the number of days when they have tremor and the number of the days they don't. It's a better picture than the monthly or the 2 weekly visit to the clinician's office. Or maybe I instrument a clinic performance test. So I've got a timed up and go test, which normally my clinician would use a stopwatch to figure out how long it takes someone to get up, walk 3 meters, turn around and go back and sit back down again. And that's a good endpoint. But if I put sensors on that person, I can then measure all sorts of aspects of how they conduct that movement. And in particular, the way they turn, that 180-degree turn, the number of steps they take, how balanced they are. That can tell me a lot more about perhaps their risk of falling when they go back home than perhaps just the simple measure of how long it took them to get up and sit back down again. So I kind of feel richer insights is my key takeaway.
Kate?
Yeah, I feel like this is a tough question, and I don't want to repeat exactly what Bill just said. But being able to collect information about a person in their real world, right? Like we can do these tests in a clinic and they can perform well on a 6-minute walk test, but does that translate to how they're actually living in their real world? I think being able to look at endpoints or biomarkers through that lens of what the patient is actually doing and how they're doing it in their life, I think that really is exciting, and I hope that continues to really motivate people to use these tools moving forward.
Taking all the good ones, guys. It is a really difficult question. From my perspective, from where I am currently, I think that everything that everyone said here today is completely true, and I think it all needs to be taken into consideration. But there needs to be an element of open-mindedness to take a bit more risk and exploring this area. And thinking how, when we're doing these sort of trials, like identifying these new endpoints, we're really thinking how can we add more value, and how can we bring that back into the healthcare system? And that's something that we're seeing already. There's lots of little examples of that, but I'd like to just continue seeing it, and people really going out there and exploring, thinking, particularly from an industry point of view, around new business models. How can we start building this into a business model? How can we start closing the loop? How can we start increasing value of what we're offering by capturing these new endpoints and these new data, objective data points within each individual in the real world? That is, we can personalize and hopefully start adding some prediction prevention around that service to add more value eventually.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for a very interesting session. Thank you for your time. I've certainly learned a lot. I'd just like to say for any of the audience, if you'd like to get in touch with any of our panelists, or if you've got further questions, please do so via the Giant Health website, or as Jacob mentioned earlier, the Giant Health page on the Thrive website, thrivewearables.com. And I think we've now got time for 20 minutes of live Q&A. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks very much.